Yay.
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 Let's note our scripts right now.
Yeah. Agrawal. This doesn't have my name. Oh, why is her script so long?
Usually they don't include the script. I guess they decided to. You're gonna steal it? No.
You gotta
Someone
get
needs
your
to
own.
give you a copy.
Okay.
Tell them that someone needs
What number is that?
to 5.
5? Okay.
Sorry. I don't mean to be.
That's not the out cue.
It's fine.
The out cue is wrong.
There are some things that are wrong with the script, but we will make it happen. From impacts of the new state budget to those of the federal budget, in the wake of the attacks in Brussels, sorry, I have to do this out loud, the NYPD has deployed special heavily armed counterterrorism teams to major landmarks and transportation hubs across the city. But Obama's proposed 2017 budget includes cuts to the city's anti-terrorism funds, and as Laura Gamba reports, this has some security experts concerned. It's the worst. From impacts of the new state budget to those of the federal budget, in the wake of the attacks in Brussels... You're listening to Uptown.
When you actually started to look at the actual
raising the minimum wage.
I think that
Of course I get sick now.
It was 11:30 in the
Now to another kind of...
Michael Brundage is showing me
the argument being made.
I'm Bob Garfield. On this week's On the Media, the press critic in chief takes all of us to task.
It's worth asking.
Looking out the window of New York City 4 years ago. When I moved to New York,
Looking out the window.
when I moved
You're listening to Uptown Radio. It's April 1st. I'm Alison Vickrobeck.
And I'm Katie Ferguson. New York City's first resource center for the transgender community is opening this month in the Bronx and promises to provide wider access to health care.
No other person outside of the transgender community feels like they can only go to one doctor.
Con Ed announced it will be introducing a new high-tech meter to make its customers more aware of their everyday energy usage.
The electric utility industry is one of the biggest polluters in the world.
Frequent helicopter tours along the Hudson River have caused major noise disturbances for locals, but new rules are hoping to quiet things down.
I've literally gone into the bathtub and gone under the water to get away from them, and I can hear them under the water.
Also on today's show, a new budget will increase minimum wage to $15 in New York, while nationally, stars of the U.S. women's soccer team have filed a lawsuit for equal pay.
All that and more on Uptown Radio, but first, the news.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Lakshmi Singh. The U.S. and Japan are making good on a 2014 pact to transfer nuclear material from the Japanese side of Tokaimura to South Carolina, despite ongoing legal threats from South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley. NPR's Scott Horsley says President Obama sought to reassure the global community this week that worldwide cooperation has measurably reduced the risk of nuclear terrorism, though it still remains a serious threat.
The president addressed a gathering of more than 50 world leaders attending the Nuclear Security Summit here in Washington. He says their efforts have made it harder for would-be terrorists to obtain nuclear materials, but he warns the threat isn't going away.
There is no doubt that if these madmen ever got their hands on a nuclear bomb or nuclear material, they most certainly would use it to kill as many innocent people as possible.
Obama says the U.S. is doing its part, reducing its stockpiles of highly enriched uranium and providing a public inventory of those stockpiles for the first time in a decade. Scott Horsley, NPR News, the White House.
The CIA confirms it accidentally left explosive material on a school bus after agents conducted a training exercise. Authorities in Loudoun County, Virginia, say that part of the material was found in the bus's engine compartment during routine maintenance. By that time, the bus had already made 8 runs with high school and elementary school students on board. The CIA says the explosive materials were stable and no students were in danger. Desperation appears to be escalating among thousands of asylum seekers who've been unable to move on to other parts of Europe from Greece. The country is preparing to begin deporting unchecked new arrivals on Monday. Joanna Kakissis reports from Thessaloniki on one case where migrants fought to break out of a detention center.
Hundreds of migrants have left a closed camp on the island of Chios after fights broke out there late Thursday night. 3 migrants were hospitalized and much of the camp is damaged. Greek authorities are expected to transfer them to a new camp. The old camp is what the EU calls a hotspot, a fenced-in center where migrants are detained and their asylum requests are processed. They cannot leave these camps. The camp on Chios was so overcrowded that migrants demanded to leave. The UN's refugee agency said it was concerned about the conditions there. Migrants who arrived on Greek islands after March 20th face deportation to Turkey. For NPR News, I'm Joanna Kakissis in Thessaloniki.
A different kind of protest underway in Chicago. Teachers in a one-day strike against education funding cuts in the Chicago school system. The job action meant no school today for nearly 350,000 students. The Labor Department's reporting the economy added 15,000 jobs in March. That's 215,000 jobs added. The unemployment rate ticked up to 5%. This is NPR News.
In New York, I'm Nina Agarwal. Hillary Clinton was in Syracuse today to unveil a $10 billion plan to revitalize manufacturing. The plan would draw on federal funding to support businesses that pledge not to move jobs or headquarters abroad. The former state senator's visit is part of a broader campaign effort to connect with New York voters, and particularly rural and working-class voters, ahead of the state's presidential primary on April 19. Supporters greeted her with a rousing chant of "Let's Go Orange" in anticipation of the Final Four basketball game this weekend. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers says it has tentative plans to build a giant set of gates across the mouth of Jamaica Bay to prevent flooding. The Corps had considered a different option favored by environmentalists, keeping the mouth open and building a set of berms, walls, and other protections along the bay's interior shore. But project manager Dan Felt said the gates make more sense.
When you actually started to look at the actual details, you noticed how much construction it would require, and a lot of this construction in the wetlands, and that, in fact, it wasn't nearly as environmentally friendly as at first we thought.
the gates are estimated to cost $2 billion, but neither the Corps nor other agencies have committed any funding so far. Suspensions in New York public schools between July and December of last year were down 32% compared to the same period in 2014. The New York City Department of Education released the data yesterday and said the decline was largely the result of changes in disciplinary policies designed to de-escalate situations. However, suspensions for serious offenses, such as assault or carrying a weapon, remained at roughly the same level. A new report by the Center for an Urban Future at CUNY found that New Yorkers commute more than their national counterparts. In the majority of the city's neighborhoods, the average resident commutes 40 minutes to work, compared to 26 minutes nationally. Most commuters use mass transit, but commuters in Staten Island and parts of Queens and the Bronx rely much more on cars and taxis. And though Manhattan remains the employment center, New Yorkers are more likely to commute to work in their own borough. Weather this afternoon will be pleasant and a little muggy, with a high of 75 and heavy thunderstorms expected to begin around 7 p.m. Nina Agarwal, Columbia Radio News.
Governor Andrew Cuomo and the state legislature finalized the state budget early this morning, just hours after the official deadline. The more than 700-page budget outlines nearly $150 billion in spending. Cuomo backed off a plan to cut state funding for CUNY schools, but increased funding for school aid by $1.5 billion. And his biggest victory, winning the right to raise the minimum wage to $15 per hour.
Raising the minimum wage in and of itself is a very progressive, very fair and appropriate initiative.
Our reporter, Stephen Basaha, has been looking into what this new budget means for New Yorkers. Stephen, what have you learned about the minimum wage increase?
Well, it's all about compromise. Because while New York City will see the full increase by 2020, the rest of New York will see a slower rollout over the next 6 years. I spoke with former New York State Democratic Assembly member Richard Brodsky, and he says that minimum wage compromise hurts New Yorkers upstate.
I think that the notion that upstate can't afford that is not true as a matter of economics. The political part, fine, but the point of the increased minimum wage is not to give charity to people. It's to stimulate economic growth by making sure that working people have enough money to spend in their local communities. That's even more true in the suffering upstate cities than it is in the booming downstate economy.
We've seen in the New York Times editorial board and places like the Gotham Gazette criticize this year's budget meetings for being a little more closed than they usually are, as far as closed off to the public and not being as transparent. Is that a fair analysis of this?
No, it's ridiculous. There are no legislative bodies in the world that make substantial negotiations in public. I understand that in the textbooks and in the laboratories, there are negotiations that are people sit at the table and say, well, what do you think? And the other guy says, well, what do you think? And the other woman says, I think this. That's not the way the world works. It's not the way the world works anywhere. So the elitist critique of the legislative process has some truth to it, but it's also full of imaginary stuff that people who have never served in public office have no idea what they're talking about.
Out of this budget bill, what is the first thing that regular New Yorkers are going to notice first that came out of it that's going to directly affect their lives?
Well, you can always say that the minimum wage is going to not just help people who earn a minimum wage, but it's also going to be a spur to economic growth in communities across the state. I suspect that kind of jolt to the local economies can be a good thing.
What are other parts of this budget that have been getting the same amount of attention as things like minimum wage that can have pretty strong impacts on the state?
Everything else that's in the budget. The press fascination with jamming non-budget items into the budget, like ethics, has obscured the fact that the state had been in an austerity mode for years. This budget seems to reverse that because A, the cash is there, and B, the political will is there. The services that people use are going to be improved, and that's what matters in all of this.
Former New York State Assembly member and an adjunct assistant professor of public policy at the Robert F. Wagner Graduate School of Public Service. Thank you for taking the time to talk with us.
You're welcome.
From impacts of the new state budget to those of the federal budget, in the wake of the attacks in Brussels, the NYPD has deployed special, heavily armed counterterrorism teams to major landmarks and transportation hubs across the city. But Obama's proposed 2017 budget includes cuts to the city's anti-terrorism funds. And as Laura Gamba reports, this has some security experts concerned.
It was 11:30 in the morning, and Columbia University students Jack Goodman and Beatrice Vernon had just found out about the attacks in Brussels. They were taking the subway at Columbus Circle, but Goodman's MetroCard didn't work.
As the train rolled in, I, in the heat of the moment, jumped over the barrier and got slightly caught.
Suddenly, this woman with braids, wearing a hoodie and jeans, came up to us and she said, "Don't panic," and flashed us her NYPD badge.
An undercover policewoman, the type of officer there might be less of in the future. That's if Obama's proposed spending plan for 2017 cuts the budget for an anti-terrorism program called the Urban Area Security Initiative.
The Urban Area Security Initiative is focused on large urban areas. It funds the development of counterterrorism capability at the local level.
That was counterterrorist expert Brian Nussbaum. Last year, New York City received over $180 million, but Nussbaum says the White House proposal would cut the city funding in half.
It would really rein in particular programs, make paying for event security for particular high-profile events, whether it's the UN General Assembly or New Year's Eve in Manhattan.
The funding that would be cut also pays for an extra 550 counterterrorism officers. You know, those RoboCop policemen armed with machine guns, bulletproof vests, and helmets. Jitsia B is a New Yorker who takes a train from Grand Central every day. She says she has been seeing more agents since the attacks in Brussels.
A large amount of police officers and also like soldiers over there.
And you hadn't seen them?
Right, or there were a few, but never this many.
Richard Frankel is a retired FBI agent. He says he's concerned that New York City police force will be weakened if budget cuts are made.
It could affect their training. It could affect the amount of people they have to respond. It will have a definite negative impact.
He says if the budget is tightened, the city of New York would also have less
surveillance, undercover officers, cameras,
which are there to help the city's anti-terrorism forces keep an eye on bad guys.
It could be that a target that they are interested in has met with other people, and now they want to find out if it is actually part of a terrorist cell. It could be that maybe there was something handed off between different people. It could be that somebody who wanted to commit a terrorist act was surveilling a location, and they want to see what locations this person has been at.
So surveilling a city with 8 million people can be tricky.
Security is a delicate balance between protecting the public and also allowing the civil liberties of everyone to remain intact.
That's Matthew Horace, formerly with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives.
Just imagine what would happen at every subway station in New York City if we had to do primary screening prior to getting to the train stations.
He says you can never have too many resources invested in security.
Let's face it, we all want to see more, better, and greater. So if there's money attached to that to give us more resources, then we're all better off because of it.
According to Mayor de Blasio, New York City has stopped more than 20 terrorist plots since 9/11, 4 of them during the past 2 years. So Nussbaum, counterterrorism expert, says slashing funds that would help protect New York City is not a good idea, especially after New York has proven it has done a good job investing the money in security.
New York has a reputation amongst state and local governments as having done a good job with the resources it's received. And there's not really a lot of question. New York remains one of the highest risk targets in the country. And so I think a lot of people were very surprised by the proposal to cut the funding that much.
Obama's final annual proposal will be voted on by Congress later this year. Laura Gamba, Columbia Radio News.
A law passed last year was supposed to help applicants with criminal records have a fair shot at finding employment. But as reporter Oliver Arnoldi found out, it's one thing to pass a law, but implementation is something different altogether.
Michael Brundage is showing me what it's like to apply for a job online.
So I'm looking at GNC website now. About to apply for a sales associate, a position at Grand Central Terminal.
Brundage doesn't need a job for himself. He works for the Fortune Society, a re-entry group that helps formerly incarcerated people. Specifically, he helps them find jobs. But lately, he's been getting calls from clients saying that something's not right.
Clearly asked me, have you been convicted of or pleaded guilty to a crime including felony and or misdemeanor?
He goes through other entry-level job applications at a 7-Eleven and Banana Republic. Both ask applicants to check a box if they've been convicted of a crime.
What they're doing is what the ban the box is trying not to do, which is giving someone a fair chance at it. They're taking that chance away.
These companies are breaking the Fair Chance Act, also known as Ban the Box, which stops employers from asking applicants if they have a criminal record until after they've given them a conditional job offer. There are 70 million people in the United States who have a criminal record. So New York City and many other states are adopting Ban the Box laws in an effort to help get these people back to work.
When I see the box on the form, I get very upset.
Rodney Brown knows firsthand how hard it is to find a job after prison. He was released last August after several stints inside for fraud and drug charges.
I apply for jobs online, they call me. Okay, now, let me ask you, do you have a felony conviction? I said, hold on, you're not supposed to ask me that. You got a felony? I said, you're not supposed to ask me that. Well, I'm sorry, thank you for the interview, and that's it.
But if it's law, why is this happening? According to the National Center for Victims of Crime, 1 in 6 violent crimes in the United States happens at work. Molly Brogan-Day works for the National Association of Small Businesses, and she says businesses are concerned about liability.
When you're not allowed to ask this kind of information up front, it really puts the business owner in a really delicate position with regards to the safety of their clients and their employees.
And because the Fair Chance Act only lets employers run background checks at the end of the process, Brogan-Day says it's a drain on resources.
It could be upwards of a month to 6 to even 8 weeks for the whole process of a first interview, a second interview, and then offering the job. And then if you find out that there is a deal breaker in terms of the background check, you waste a lot of time and money in doing that.
At the Legal Action Center, senior attorney Kate Wagner-Goldstein thinks
that with any new law, some employers are slow to start implementing it, so there may be some backlog just because of that, but I don't think there's much excuse.
Ultimately,
there should be aggressive enforcement of the law so that employers realize that there are consequences.
The city's Commission on Human Rights is the group responsible for the enforcement of the Act, and right now it seems focused more on educating employers about the law than enforcement. They hold workshops every week for employers to learn about their legal obligations. I went to one in Staten Island earlier this week, and I was the only one there. So it's hard to tell whether businesses don't know about the law or simply don't care. Either way, it puts job seekers like Brown and groups like the Fortune Society in a watchdog position.
You can pass as many laws as you want to. However, if the culture doesn't change, then it's all for naught.
Kingsley Rowe recently started teaching at NYU and was one of NYU's first hires under the Fair Chance Act. Rowe served nearly 30 years for manslaughter after accidentally killing a friend with a handgun when he was 18. But, he says when he applied to NYU, the process
It allowed me to keep my dignity. It allowed me to keep my self-respect.
Whether more employers will give that opportunity remains to be seen. The city's Commission on Human Rights says it will keep holding workshops to train employers on compliance. Hopefully, more people will show up. Oliver Arnoldi, Columbia Radio News.
Now to another kind of discrimination. The U.S. women's soccer team has gone from World Cup win to wage inequality. The women's team has won the World Cup no less than 3 times, and the Olympics 4. The men's national team hasn't even made it to the finals of the World Cup in the past 50 years.
But the female players are getting paid less. And earlier this week, 5 of them filed a federal complaint. I spoke to Grant Wall, a senior writer at Sports Illustrated, and asked him what this lawsuit is all about.
The argument being made this week by the U.S. women's players is the men get paid essentially around 4 times as much as we do. And that the women are arguing this should be equal work. We're being asked to do the same amount of work by U.S. soccer, therefore equal pay.
Yeah, and the women's team is doing well and better than the men's team.
It is. I mean, reasonable people can disagree on this front. I happen to think there are some very good reasons the U.S. women should be paid equally to the men. I don't think the U.S. women win more is at the top of the list of arguments.
U.S. Soccer said last night that the men's national team had doubled the attendance and revenue of the women's team, plus stronger TV ratings. And I think the projected figures for the next few years have the U.S. men's team projected to make, $60 million, and the U.S. women's team to make $51, which doesn't seem like a huge... I mean, those seem somewhat comparable.
The numbers on how much revenue is being brought in by the U.S. women versus the men. There's disagreement over those. U.S. Soccer is also saying, Sunil Gulati, the president, that revenue generation should be a very important factor in how much you get paid, whether you're men's team or women's team. And as you say, there's disagreement over that as well. I mean, U.S. Soccer is a non-profit organization. So, and this is international competition. This is not a for-profit private business.
Something that I think people are wondering is, how could this potentially affect the Olympics in Rio this summer?
Right now, we're still waiting for the Chicago court to decide in hopefully early June whether the women's CBA still exists with U.S. Soccer. If they say it does.
Can you explain what exactly a collective bargaining agreement is?
So, a collective bargaining agreement is an agreement between employer and employees. We see it often in sports with players' unions. The U.S. Men's Players Union has their own collective bargaining agreement with U.S. Soccer. The U.S. Women's players have their own collective bargaining agreement with U.S. Soccer. And it provides guarantees as far as a lot of things when it comes to payment, conditions for the players on the road. There is a no strike provision in that CBA, and by law, the U.S. women would not be allowed to strike before the Olympics. They would have to wait until January 1, 2017, when they have a lot less leverage because there are no major women's soccer events in 2017 or in 2018. So if this Chicago court in early June were to decide that the CBA does not exist with the U.S. women, they would instantly be in a position where they could strike before the Olympics, which I don't think anybody wants the U.S. women, including them themselves, to miss the Olympics. They only have 2 major events every 4 years. But that would certainly put U.S. Soccer in a position where they would probably be willing to give up more things to get the women on the field for the Olympics.
Well, Grant Wall, senior writer at Sports Illustrated, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So, Katie, what are you doing this Sunday?
You know, the usual. Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling.
That sounds exciting. Well, if you live in Lower Manhattan, the Sunday is perfect for that. A new deal prohibits helicopter tourism on Sundays and cuts flights by 50% for the rest of the week. As Adrian Ma reports, the compromise deal has left both sides dissatisfied.
Looking out the window of Karen McDermott's 20th floor apartment in Battery Park City, you can see for miles and miles. Can you describe what we're looking at here?
We're looking at the Hudson River. We're looking at some nice quiet ferries. And then we're looking up at some really loud helicopters.
After taking off from a heliport at the southern tip of Manhattan, the choppers ferry tourists up and down the Hudson for an Instagrammable view of the city. Every few minutes, another one buzzes by. Even though McDermott grew up near LaGuardia Airport and was used to the sound of planes, she says helicopters are different.
You're feeling it in your chest. You actually physically feel them. You don't just hear them.
And standing in her living room, even with the windows closed, I can feel a low vibration with each passing helicopter. Before moving here a few months ago, McDermott says she lived next to the West Side Highway.
And I never could have imagined that moving away from the highway and facing the water would be louder than the highway going onto the Battery Tunnel. So as high as I put my music or if I put on the TV, it doesn't matter. I've literally gone into the bathtub and gone under the water to get away from them, and I can hear them under the water.
The goal of the new agreement is to help reduce some of the chopper noise in the neighborhood. But even with half as many flights and Sundays off, Battery Park residents like McDermott will see, and more importantly hear, some 30,000 helicopter flights buzz by their windows in the next year. That's about 1 helicopter every 10 minutes. And all that noise can have real health effects. Richard Natzel teaches environmental science at the University of Michigan, where he studies the effect of environmental noise on human health. He says, we've known for a long time that excessive noise can hurt your hearing, But
that may just be the tip of the iceberg in terms of the impact of noise on the human body.
Naetzel says even being exposed to lower levels of noise for a prolonged period
basically activates this fight or flight response and keeps you in a constantly stressed state, and that can lead to cardiovascular disease, to hypertension, high blood pressure. It's also being increasingly associated with things like depression and mental health issues.
I sympathize, and the industry sympathizes, which is why we continuously try to make adjustments. But at some point, we're not going to be the scapegoat for every bit of sound that someone hears.
Sam Goldstein works for the Helicopter Tourism and Jobs Council, and he says that helicopter tourism has been a net positive for the city.
People seeking a helicopter tour of New York City, this is a bucket item that they're really excited to do, and therefore it's going to be one of the first things they arrange.
And while the city hasn't given precise figures on the economic impact of helicopter tourism, Goldstein is certain the flight reduction will mean a loss of tourism dollars. And there's another thing. He says helicopter tour operators employ about 250 pilots, mechanics, and sales staff. And as operators see their businesses chopped in half, they may also have to cut jobs.
It's going to be tough. But this is something that we did because we believe that this agreement will ensure that there continue to be tours in New York City.
And that's good news for John Culpepper, who's on vacation from Dallas, Texas. I meet him and his wife as they're walking out of the downtown heliport. What did you think?
It's cool.
It's pretty awesome.
When I tell him the tours will eventually be reduced by half because some residents have been complaining, he says,
I'd hate to see that. I'd hate to see them lose it.
Even though, like, some people are going nuts on the west side?
They need to get a life. You know, they have to understand where they are, where you live, and what's here. This is not for them. This is for the world.
For McDermott and other anti-chopper activists, that's precisely the problem. Adrian Ma, Columbia Radio News.
You can meet a lot of interesting characters when you live in New York. Weird dates, shady landlords, and the occasional con artist. Commentator Amina Lovell tells us she fell for her chance to buy a big break.
When I moved to New York City 4 years ago, I wasn't some naive, fresh-off-the-boat foreigner. I was a sophisticated urban traveler. I had already lived in Miami, San Antonio, Atlanta, and Washington, D.C. I was an assimilated Caribbean American, and I had plans. I was working as a personal assistant to a celebrity mom, the wife of Ellie Reed, the CEO of Sony Music, but I was only making about $1,200 a month, barely able to afford my apartment. I often found myself having to decide between a $10 round-trip ticket home on New Jersey Transit or a turkey sandwich and a Sprite from the deli downstairs for dinner. One afternoon, I was picking up gluten-free cookies at Citarella on the Upper East Side for my boss when a man approached, asking for directions. He was wearing faded baggy jeans that looked a size too big, dirty white sneakers, and a multicolored jean jacket. He reminded me of a character from The Wizard of Oz. It was a sunny day, yet he was using a tall black umbrella as a cane. I pointed him in the right direction when he paused, smiled, and said, "You have such a great voice. Have you ever done any voiceover work?" Really? My parents, family, friends have always told me I speak way too fast, and my accent can turn sentences into a curried, stewed mess. He said he was a famous voiceover coach, and he was casting for a new movie. He wanted me to play the part of a monkey. Yeah, a monkey. I know what you're thinking. You really can bump into someone on the street in New York, and they can change your lives forever. The movies are real. Not really. But the thing is, I wanted it to be real. I desperately wanted to believe that something like this could happen to me, that I was the exception to the rule. I wanted to be an on-air journalist since I was a little girl, but until this encounter, I'd filed that dream away. Could this be my chance to make it a reality? He laid on the spiel thick, whipping out business cards of people he knew and had worked with, called people on the phone, letting them know he'd found the monkey at last, constantly reminding me how big of a deal he is. And that's what I wanted to hear. I'd applied and been rejected from 5 different graduate schools. At only 24, I was in the middle of a difficult divorce. And while I was living in the city of my dreams, my career consisted of shopping for challah bread for a celebrity. I wanted a miracle. I wasn't gullible. I was just looking for an easy way out. And if I'm honest with you, I was being a little vain. Someone singles you out of a crowd and says you have star quality. It makes you feel special. Something I had not felt for a very long time. So when he dropped the price tag, for only $240, I could be plucked out of obscurity and rocketed into superstardom. I jumped at the possibility. We walked to the ATM and I withdrew the money. $240 in 20s. I put it in his hands, then watched my new voiceover agent disappear around the corner with a wave. A few hours later, I realized I'd been left with a fake email address and a need to reevaluate my expectations. I felt dumb, ashamed of myself because I knew better. Once again, I filed my dream away. Then I decided to check my ego and balance my belief in myself with some cold, hard reality. Now, 4 years later, I'm about to graduate with a master's in journalism from an Ivy League school. It cost a lot more than $240 and took a lot of hard work. I do have expectations for my future, but I know they won't come from a quick and easy fix. I've also stopped giving directions to strangers.
Amina Lovell still lives in New York and has stopped looking for shortcuts to achieve her goals.
You're listening to Uptown Radio.
There's more to come. Stay with us. You're listening to Uptown Radio. I'm Allison Vickrebeck.
And I'm Katie Ferguson.
Coming up on our show, the city's first transgender resource center will be opening later this month in the Bronx.
Plus, what do Spider-Man, Elmo, and Minnie Mouse have in common?
Great costumes?
Sure, but they also may not be so happy with possible changes coming to Times Square.
These stories and more, but first, the news.
Starting today, 1 million of the poorest Americans will begin to lose their benefits. For the first time since the recession, a time limit is being placed on benefits received from the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, which used to be known as food stamps. Under the new guidelines, all able-bodied adults will lose SNAP after 3 months if they do not work for at least 80 hours per month. 45,000 New York residents will be affected by the change. New York City officials are joining state and federal agencies today to discuss how to combat the potential spread of Zika virus in the United States. The one-day Zika Action Plan Summit is taking place in Atlanta. It is hoping to ensure a coordinated response to the mosquito-borne disease that is linked to the birth defect microcephaly. Dr. Tom Frieden, the director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, says that more infrastructure needs to be put in place by the United States.
No state would say they have enough money and staff to respond effectively today, because this is a big challenge. There's a shortage of entomologists out there. There's a shortage of dollars to do the extensive things that are needed. Out there.
Addressing the growing threat of groups like ISIS, President Obama joins world leaders today in Washington, D.C. at the Nuclear Security Summit to discuss the need to safeguard nuclear weapons. Amina Lovell has more.
The extensive
10 days after Brussels airport was struck by suicide bombers, the airport known as the Heart of Europe is still closed. The continued closure of the airport is causing hassle for thousands of business and holiday travellers, as well as severe financial losses for Belgium's capital. 600 flights have been suspended since the March 22nd attacks, and hotel reservations have halved. It is unclear when the airport will reopen. South African President Jacob Zuma apologised to his countrymen today in an attempt to end a long-running corruption scandal. South African courts held Zuma responsible for the misappropriation of state funds. He said he would abide by a court ruling and repay government money spent on revamping his mansion. Zuma spent some $23 million on his private residence. Addressing the growing threat of groups like ISIS, President Obama joins world leaders today in Washington, D.C. at the Nuclear Security Summit to discuss the need to safeguard nuclear weapons. Amina Lovell has more.
Speaking with world leaders today, President Obama emphasized the need to keep nuclear material out of the wrong hands.
The single most effective defense against nuclear terrorism is fully securing this material so it doesn't fall into the wrong hands in the first place. And just the smallest amount of plutonium, about the size of an apple, could kill and injure hundreds of thousands of innocent people.
President Obama goes on to warn that if madmen like ISIL were to get a hold of these materials, the consequences would be dire.
It would be a humanitarian, political, economic, and environmental catastrophe with global ramifications for decades. It would change our world.
Also discussed at the summit was concern about nuclear-defiant North Korea. Obama joined South Korean President Park Geun-hye and Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe on Thursday in vowing to ramp up pressure on Pyongyang in response to its recent nuclear and missile tests. Amina Lovell, Columbia Radio News.
Oliver Arnoldi, Columbia Radio News.
Transgender New Yorkers will soon have their own place to hang out. The Bronx Trans Collective is opening later this month. It's the first of its kind in the city. As Shandukani Muladzi reports, access to health care will be one of its primary missions.
On the basement floor of 937 Summit Avenue, a building not too far from Yankee Stadium, I meet Mr. Chris. He's unpacking some boxes and checking inventory for the grand opening of the Bronx Trans Collective.
And the reason why we call it the Bronx Trans Collective is because it's a collective of organizations, and we want it to also be collective of resources.
Resources like assistance with immigration, housing, group counseling, and legal name changes. Mr. Chris is co-founder of Community Kinship Life, one of 2 organizations that will offer healthcare options and referrals to trans individuals. Because, he says, their needs haven't always been taken seriously by the wider medical community.
No other person outside of the transgender community feels like they can only go to one doctor. So we will have resource lists. We'll let them know, well, listen, these are the places that you can go that offer the care that you need.
Needs like hormone replacement, gender-confirming surgeries, plastic surgeries, and
HIV care, Hep C care, PrEP, which is pre-exposure prophylaxis to help prevent contracting HIV.
And they'll even help with finding a primary care physician. Because Mr. Chris says even something as simple as that can be a daunting experience for trans patients. Like for Courtney Washington, who waited 10 years before getting help finding a doctor.
I was getting my hormones black market. I wasn't getting them through a doctor, and I was afraid. Sometimes they act like they don't want to touch you.
And other times, doctors just ask the wrong questions, like what happened to Michelle Green.
I go to a foot doctor, but they're asking me if I'm pre-op or post-op, and I'm just like, what does, me being transgender have to do with my foot?
Green says she was also using black market pills because she didn't have insurance. She says now that she has a doctor who understands her needs, she's healthier and knows what's happening to her body.
Right now, my levels are very high, so now I know that, okay, maybe I need to take a break from the hormones for a minute.
For Green, it's about time a center like this opened in her neighborhood.
We have so many great organizations that are spread about, and just to have everybody underneath one roof, I think that would help me get the best care that I need and help the community get the best care that the community needs as a whole, so that we all can become healthy and move to the next level.
And what would that next level be? Well, Councilman Richie Torres says that the other boroughs should start similar centers because trans people face levels of discrimination that most of us will never know. Torres himself will be cutting the ribbon at the grand opening on April 15th. Shandukani Miralzi, Columbia Radio News.
Public Service Commission and Con Ed have teamed up to make smart meters available in everyone's home. As Jeffy Bernard reports, these meters will allow you to track your energy use in real time rather than waiting for the monthly bill.
Hi, how are you?
Hey, how are you?
Corinne Lawrence lives in East Flatbush, and a huge part of her income every month goes to paying her electricity.
The most recent bill we had was $732, and that was in the space of 2 months.
That bill is determined because once a month, somebody from Con Ed goes to her house and checks that meter. That's how almost everybody in New York's bill is figured out. But Con Ed's new meter may change that. The company says the new smart meter means people will be able to think differently about their electricity and ultimately use less of it. That's good for the environment and customers' bank accounts. Patty Kim is one of the project managers of the advanced meter infrastructure at Con Ed.
So in some of our service territories of Con Edison, currently we have what's called AMR, which is a one-way communicating meter. The smart meter that we will be deploying will allow us to have two-way communication with the customer and the company.
She says that Con Ed will soon be able to provide real-time data where the customer can see what their energy consumption usage was just 15 minutes earlier.
If I log in at 2 o'clock, I can see what my usage was at 1:45.
It means that if you can check your electricity every day, then you're aware of it. Sort of like wearing a pedometer to keep track of your steps or using an app to count the amount of calories you eat. The idea is that having constant access to your energy usage information can change your habits. For Lawrence, that means she'd be able to figure out why she's using so much electricity.
Because if you can be on your phone and you can be, somewhere out of the home and still be able to access what's going on at that time, or get alerts to say, hey, your bill is going too high, you might want to reduce your usage, that would always be helpful.
But that also means Con Ed has much more specific information about its customers, and that can be a bit worrying.
I'm one of those people who always wonder when people put electronic things in your home, is it just for that purpose only? Sometimes you wonder, is it to also monitor things or, you gotta be cynical sometimes these days.
Nobody is talking about using this data to pry into the lives of customers.
That's Carl Rabago. He's the executive director of Pace Energy and Climate Center in White Plains, New York. He says the bigger concern is the environmental footprint we're already leaving behind.
The electric utility industry is one of the biggest polluters in the world. Ultimately, our electricity use goes back to the burning of coal and natural gas.
Rabago says the meters we have right now don't really help us to be active participants in our energy use management. He says it's about time the information age and technology came to the utility industry. And as for New Yorkers, they should expect to see the rollout of the smart meter sometime in the fall of 2017. Jeffy Bernard, Columbia Radio News.
The city's commercial trash collection may be getting a bit cleaner thanks to a new bill. But for private waste companies, this trash is not only their treasure, it's their livelihood. Nina Agarwal reports that the waste companies don't think this new proposal will work.
On Earth Day last year, Mayor Bill de Blasio revealed his One NYC plan. He pledged to drastically reduce the amount of garbage the city produces in the next 15 years.
Zero waste for our landfills. We're going to constantly drive down the amount of waste we create through composting, through better recycling, to the point that nothing goes from New York City to a landfill in the future.
It's a tall order, and environmental advocates say key to meeting it is changing how the city collects commercial waste. The city picks up residential trash, but all the commercial trash, from restaurants, bars, and office buildings, gets picked up by private companies. Sean Cade works for one of these companies, Number One Waste and Recycler. It's run by his family, who are immigrants from Yemen. Cade's cousin drives while he hangs off the back. Every couple blocks, he jumps off, picks up garbage bags, and tosses them into the truck.
It's not bad, but pays the bills,
Cade's family owns 2 garbage trucks. They work long shifts, at least 9 or 10 hours a night, 6 nights a week. They drive all over Brooklyn and Manhattan. That's how it is for most of the nearly 250 private companies that are licensed to pick up commercial trash in the city. They compete with each other for contracts and go wherever they have business. That means lots of trucks crisscrossing the city, using lots of fuel, and causing lots of air pollution. A coalition of environmental and labor advocates called Transform, Don't Trash is currently working with the city council to introduce a new bill that would streamline private garbage collection. Matt Ryan is the executive director of Align, one of the groups leading the coalition.
In this scenario, the city would create geographic zones across the 5 boroughs, and people would bid then on those geographic zones.
The way it works now, companies compete fiercely for individual contracts. And activists like Ryan say that's been a big problem from an environmental and safety perspective.
In this highly competitive Darwinian situation here, the first thing a company is most likely going to do to try to save a contract is to cut costs wherever they can.
He says a city-managed zoning system would change that. Companies would be able to win bids to collect garbage from all of the businesses in a zone, which would give them steady work. And the city would only award contracts to companies who met their standards.
We want to make sure that you have the highest recycling standards and help meet the zero waste goal for the city. We want to make sure we understand where you take the trash. And thirdly, we want to see a safe industry.
Dominic Monopoly is the owner of Philco Karting, a large family-run karting company in Brooklyn.
The concept is just not going to work. We service approximately 3,000, 3,500 customers a day. We get near zero complaints. There's no way that the city's going to be picked up as efficiently as it is now.
On top of that, he says, it's just not fair.
I've been servicing some of my customers for 50 years. What gives the city the right to go to them and say, well, now you have to use this guy?
Monopoly also doubts that one exclusive company can offer customers better service.
Most of my major customers have my home phone number and my cell phone. You know, I've had calls on Christmas morning because a florist burnt down and we were working Christmas afternoon to clean it up. You're not going to get that personal attention if it's one guy has his own.
If the city does decide to adopt a zone system, Monopoly guesses his company is big enough and well-known enough, it'd win at least one zone. But smaller companies may not be so lucky. Remember number one waste and recycler? Monopoly says there's no way he'll stay in business.
He's got his life wrapped up there, all his money, probably 2 or 3 generations involved, and they're just out of business. And I don't think that's fair.
But Matt Ryan from the Transform Don't Trash Coalition says trash collection is already dominated by a dozen or so big companies, so it's a false trade-off. And the potential benefits of zoning are evident in the experience of other cities like Seattle and San Francisco.
This is what we've seen around the country. Whenever people have these sort of contracts in a zone systems, recycling rates spike.
He might not convince the waste haulers, but it could be a strong argument when the proposal reaches the mayor. Nina Agarwal, Columbia Radio News.
An editorial in the New York Post earlier this week accused the city of spending the money it should use for removing graffiti on the mayor's Vision Zero plan. That's the one that would reduce traffic fatalities. Today, the Department of Transportation responded by cleaning up some graffiti. Tyler Pratt reports from under the Manhattan Bridge in Chinatown.
Russ Newton is scraping old flyers and paint off a support beam on the exit ramp of the Manhattan side of the bridge.
Scrape it off just when the paint, it adheres better between the tape and the paper and all that crap.
Newton works for the Department of Transportation. In his hard hat and orange vest, he says the overcast weather is making his job a little harder.
But it's not the perfect weather right now, but we'll see what happens.
What's the perfect weather?
Well, dry and sunny. But just as long as it doesn't rain, it's fine. You know what I'm saying?
But a little further down under the bridge, you might be forgiven for thinking there is rain. Other workers are using a power washer to blast the paint off the brick walls. By the time Polly Trottenberg, the head of the Department of Transportation, showed up, they'd finished cleaning one side of the bridge.
We're here to talk about the work that our bridges divisions do, cleaning graffiti around the city.
At the busy intersection between the frequent B, D, N, and Q trains overhead, Trottenberg started off strong, defending her office's ability to clean.
In the course of a year, they will clean 4.5 million square feet of graffiti off bridges and other structures around the city.
Trottenberg says the Manhattan Bridge cleaning was already planned, but she was out today to make it clear that her department is cleaning up graffiti, spending about $1 million a year to do so. A recent editorial in the New York Post claims the city is spending less to remove graffiti because the money is going to support the mayor's Vision Zero plan to reduce traffic fatalities.
Yeah, that isn't true. The city's graffiti efforts have been constant until this year, actually, where the mayor has added, as I said, almost $7 million for new EDC cleaning crews.
EDC being the New York City Economic Development Corporation. Trottenberg mentioned plenty of times that if people or businesses see graffiti, they can call 311 and file a request to have it removed. EDC's website says they have a fleet of trucks and tools to clean businesses and streets. But Trottenberg acknowledges that finding and cleaning up graffiti just as fast as it responds isn't an easy process.
Look, I mean, graffiti is obviously a big challenge in this enormous city. We are putting, the de Blasio administration is putting, millions of dollars of resources into tackling the problem every year. I'm sure there's always more we could do. Graffiti is one of those things you do your best to try and curb it. It's a fight for the long term.
Take a walk through Chinatown today and you'll still see graffiti on every corner. But at least this afternoon, the Manhattan Bridge underpass will be tag-free, meaning by tonight, it'll probably be ready for some more. Tyler Pratt, Columbia Radio News.
This week, surgeons at Johns Hopkins University performed an organ transplant between HIV-positive patients, the first time it's ever happened in the United States. Until 2013, people who were HIV positive were banned from donating their organs.
I spoke with Dr. David Klassen, who's the Chief Medical Officer at UNOS, the United Network for Organ Sharing. He explained the procedure and its significance.
Well, what they did was transplant a liver and a kidney into separate recipients from an HIV-positive donor, and that's really kind of the unique aspect of this. There have been HIV-positive transplant recipients for a number of years in the United States, so that's not the issue. But the major newsworthy thing here is the use of the HIV-positive donor, because that is something that was prohibited by law up until fairly recently.
Would you say that this is a big deal in the world of organ transplants?
Well, it does increase the potential supply of organ donors. Organ donors and donated organs are in desperately short supply in the United States. There have been some estimates that suggest there may be something on the range of 300 to 500 HIV-positive donors per year in the United States that might possibly be available for organ donation.
I was just wondering, do you have like a ballpark estimate in terms of numbers of how many people that could help? Because you mentioned 300 to 500 HIV donors, but what about the recipients?
For kidney transplants, there are about 100,000 people currently on the list waiting for kidneys. Presumably a significant or a non-inconsequential number of those are HIV positive, although we really actually don't have that data to say that for sure.
So I was wondering about the actual procedure, if there's any issues in compatibility or are there any limitations, because I'm assuming that not everybody has the same type of HIV or, if someone actually has full-blown AIDS, does that limit who can donate and who can receive?
Yes, certainly in terms of full-blown AIDS, either a recipient or a donor with, full-blown AIDS would not be eligible for a transplant. So both donors and recipients have to have their HIV well controlled with very low or undetectable virus levels in their blood. So it is limited.
Do you know how long it'll take for us to be able to really say that this was an effective, successful operation and that we can really go on and encourage more people to have these kinds of procedures?
Well, that is one aspect that's a little bit unique about this whole situation. The HOPE Act is the name of the law that established or that allowed these transplants to take place. And it's interesting, though, that the HOPE Act requires that these transplants are really done as a research project. So it is not considered standard of care yet. And so it is sort of a national sort of research project to do that, and so the data will be evaluated as it comes in, and we'll have to see how successful these transplants are, and if there are any unanticipated adverse events.
Great. Well, thank you for your time, Dr. Klassen from UNOS.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
While doctors celebrate the first HIV organ transplant, HIV activist groups rallied in cities around the world to protest what they say is a critical issue for people with chronic health issues: high drug costs.
They marched to Pfizer headquarters in New York. Daniel Rostas stopped by the protest to find out more about their demands.
Martin Shkreli was just the tip of the iceberg. That's what these activists came here to say. After the infamous pharmaceutical CEO hiked the price of an HIV drug from $13.15 to $750 overnight last year, healthcare advocacy groups sounded the alarm about inflating drug costs. Andrew Velez was at the protest. He's a member of ACT UP. He says high drug costs affect people with all sorts of diseases, not just HIV. The group was founded in the 80s, when costs for HIV drugs were also extremely high.
I was there at the beginning.
And so why are you here now?
I'm here for the same reason. Sometimes the names change, but the battles are the same.
Elizabeth Owens has hepatitis C. Activists say it costs $84,000 to buy 12 weeks of the drugs she needs, but she says she can't afford it. She has no insurance.
How dare they sit up there and tell me that they're going to kill me and I want to live? So I'm here today to let them know. Lower those prices for hepatitis C medication because I want to live.
About 50 people marched to the steps of drug giant Pfizer's offices on 42nd Street.
Lower prices save lives! Lower prices saves lives! Lower prices saves lives! Lower prices saves lives! Lower prices!
Dr. Kenneth Caton is the director of Tufts Center for the Study of Drug Development, and there was an ACT UP protest outside of his building, too. He says these pharmaceutical companies do invest lots of money in researching and developing drugs, which is why they're so expensive. Caton says the U.S. is the only industrialized country that doesn't regulate the cost of prescription medications.
To policymakers, the developers themselves, and physicians and payers to ensure that these breakthrough drugs of the future are available to the patients who need them.
Pfizer says it supports ACT UP's right to protest. It also says it has programs to assist patients. But ACT UP says until these new drugs become affordable for people without insurance, they'll keep protesting. Daniel Rostis, Columbia Radio News.
Tourists go to Times Square to take pictures, not to get hassled by life-size cartoon characters. That's the logic behind a bill pending before City Council. It would give the Department of Transportation the authority to regulate where costumed characters can stand and do their photo ops.
This comes amid an uptick in reports of aggressive encounters with passers-by. Jilda DeCarly went to Times Square to find out more.
That's how it works. You're standing in the middle of Times Square. The lights, the screens, the movement. Maybe you came from across the world, or maybe you came from across town. You take out your phone to take a picture, and then...
I am an idol man. I'm really idol man in New York.
You're surrounded by comic book characters demanding tips. And...
But I also think that they're a little aggressive sometimes. I don't really like them either.
That's Frederick Garcia and his brother Tyler. They're only kids, but many on the city council seem to agree. Times Square Alliance, a business improvement organization, did a survey where over 50% of people said they had a negative experience with the costume characters. Experiences like this.
I said, I think they forced me into it because they kind of all gathered and you couldn't really get away, arms around you.
She says they're kind of cute, and she didn't seem too bothered by it, but so far this year, the NYPD's Times Square unit has reported 16 arrests compared to 15 in all of 2015. The solution, which is being proposed, would restrict the costume characters to certain zones within Times Square. Giovanna Mendoza works year-round dressed as Minnie Mouse. She thinks the proposed bill isn't fair. Sure, there are a few bad apples, like in any business, but she says some of the bad behavior comes from tourists.
Nosotros le decimos que trabajamos por propina y ellos dicen que sí, que aceptan.
We tell them that we work for tips. They say, yeah, okay, we accept. And the moment when we stretch out our hand for a tip, they say no, that they're not going to give us anything, because the camera is theirs, and if we even open our mouths, they're going to call the police.
Mendoza has 2 kids and makes about $50 a day. Tourists may be annoyed for a few seconds, she says, but Mendoza is hustling day in and day out. For City Councilman Daniel Gorodnik, author of the bill, balancing the needs of workers like Mendoza and those of tourists who may feel intimidated, that's the challenge he faces.
We want to make sure that Times Square continues to maintain its quirkiness, its edge. There are people who, in fact, go to Times Square and want to take a picture with an Elmo or with the Naked Cowboy or whoever. We get that, and we want to respect that. But we also want to make sure that there is an area for the people who are looking to simply pass through Times Square.
A vote on Gorodnik's bill is expected this week. Jilda DeCarly, Columbia Radio News.
This whole Times Square debate reminds commentator Stephen Basaha of his own time working as a costumed character.
About 5 summers ago, when I was between my sophomore and junior year of college, I got a job at Six Flags Great Adventure in New Jersey. I was just a hair too short to be a superhero, so I was hired as a Looney Tune. It was a great gig. I got paid to be a goofball, but it wasn't an easy job or one without rules. The first, unless you're Mel Blanc or Billy West, you don't talk in costume. One of the work legends was a guy playing Bugs Bunny who was dragged away by a park guest. The only thing he did was silently wave his arms for help. Second, there was the first rule of Fight Club. You don't talk about being a character. I'm hoping I'm past the statute of limitations on this one. The cardinal rule was that you never, ever take off your head when a guest could see you. This was challenging, especially on 100-degree days when my coworkers and I tried to guess how much warmer it was in costume rather than out. 10 degrees, 20? Some costumes were worse than others. Like the time I finally got to be Marvin the Martian's dog. I'd been begging for that one. The only problem was the costume was just too tight, and the big nose. I thought it would give me extra breathing room. Instead, it quickly filled with stagnant air. It was literally the opposite. It was the literal opposite of a splash of cold water. Each shift in costume was just an hour, but the seconds crawled by. My body wanted to quit, and to be honest, so did I. Instead, I finished my shift, and the next day I started all over again. Part of the reason I stuck with it is that it didn't matter if the job had the word loony in the title. It was a job, which meant pushing through the bad days. And I loved it. It still surprises me how meaningful some of the interactions people had with me were. Like the college student who had a phobia of people in costumes. She was so nervous around me, or shall I say bugs, she was literally shaking. I slowly reached out my paw. She took it. We even posed for a picture. Her bravery was short-lived, though. Moments later, Daffy Duck thought it'd be a great idea to get in the shot. The sight of the charging duck freaked her out. I never saw her again. What really sticks with me, though, is this one little girl. Her military dad was stationed overseas, and her mother brought her to the park almost every day to see us. She lit up when she hugged Daffy or Porky Pig, and suddenly the sweat and heat didn't matter anymore. We were helping a little girl and her mom make memories during what was probably a very lonely summer. My fans, well, they weren't really my fans. They were interacting with Bugs Bunny or Sylvester, and that's okay. It wasn't about me or how hot the costume was. I still got my fair share of memories and experiences out of the deal, even if I do regret never getting to say, what's up, Dak?
Stephen Basaha has traded in his bunny ears for headphones and still misses the four-finger gloves.
Republican presidential candidates Donald Trump and Ted Cruz are engaged in one of their most contentious battles yet. Not about ISIS, not about immigration, not about policy at all. Instead, they're fighting about their wives.
It's one thing to try to attack another candidate. It's another thing to come after my wife.
And while it might seem like a new low in a primary season that has already gotten more personal than usual, Katie Ferguson reports this type of political mudslinging has some historical precedent.
If you want to know about the worst wife war, you're going to have to go back a few years. 188, back to 1828, and the election between Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams.
Andrew Jackson's wife was called a bigamist because she had been married before.
Kerwin Swint is the author of Mudslingers, the 25 dirtiest political campaigns of all time. He says long before Trump and Cruz, the election of 1828 set a standard for just how low we can go.
Andrew Jackson's wife died during that campaign, and he attributed her death to the toll it took on her personally and blamed his opponents, the Adams campaign, for driving his wife to the grave.
So if it seems like this is the most mudslinging, the most negative campaigning we've ever had, Swint says it's not.
It was worse early on in our country's history. I mean, the 1800s were the time of really intense mudslinging and some of these personal kinds of attacks.
Swint says it's not rare to see these kinds of personal attacks play out during a presidential race, but they usually come from surrogates, like campaign personnel or political action committees. What's unusual is to see them coming from presidential candidates themselves.
When you attack someone's family in a personal way, that's not looked at as okay by the public, and so you're likely to do yourself more damage than your opponent. So there's a good practical reason for staying away from it.
Doug Farrand is a political consultant who advises candidates on media strategy. He agrees.
You don't do it because ultimately you're asking the voters to like you and trust you. And if they feel like you're just not a decent human being, then they're not likely to do that.
But the attacks between Trump and Cruz have been escalating. Gavin Kilduff is a professor at NYU's Stern School of Business, and he studies rivalries. He says between the 12 debates, 6 forums, and who knows how many tweets, the candidates have come up against each other time and time and time again.
Basically, if you find yourself competing against the same person over and over again, you develop stronger feelings of rivalry towards that person, which then have been shown to lead to basically unethical behavior. And so personal attacks are a pretty similar category of behavior.
Kilduff says studies on rivalry, mainly on rivalries in sports, have found that animus deepens with each game that's played. In a sport like soccer, that means
in the games between those rival teams, the players commit significantly higher numbers of yellow and red cards, which are often given for dangerous tackles and unsportsmanlike conduct.
And on the playing field of electoral politics, that unsportsmanlike conduct translates to trash talk. Trash talk that's just as petty as it was in the days of Andrew Jackson, but now is louder. Author Kerwin Swint says that social media is acting as a megaphone.
There's no doubt that the rise of social media has contributed to this sort of flaming effect where it's more acceptable to talk trash about your opponents and your adversaries. I mean, Trump's favorite tactic is Twitter, after all.
Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams didn't have Twitter. But as for the mudslinging in this year's presidential election, Swint says it will probably get worse. Because remember, Trump and Cruz, they're technically on the same team. But when the Democrats and Republicans pick their nominees, he says we're probably going to see more red cards. Katie Ferguson, Columbia Radio News.
Well, that does it for this edition of Uptown Radio. We hope you enjoyed the show, since this may be our last.
While we've spent the past year earning journalism degrees, it looks like there's not much of a future here.
So we're finding employment elsewhere.
You know, Stephen made dressing up as a character seem not too bad.
Next week, you can find us all in Times Square dressed up as members of the Justice League. Stop by for some photos.
But don't forget to tip.
Just kidding.
Happy April Fools.
Well, that really does it for this edition of Uptown Radio.
Our team was helmed today by executive producer Susie Shie. Leading our staff of reporters were senior producers Henriette Shakar and Aaron Galaxon.
Director Isabella Kulkarni coordinated our studio production with Adrian Ma and Jeffy Bernard.
Our web team Shandu Mulautzi and Adele Umber got the stream live to the web. Amina Level produced the news. Senior editor Jakai Johnson and assistant editor Elizabeth Brockway led our copy team.
Our instructors Carrie Donahue, Danielle Alarcon, Sally Herships, and Matt Collette advised our staff. I'm Allison Vickrebeck.
And I'm Katie Ferguson. Uptown Radio is live on Fridays at 4. Until next time, you can always find us at uptownradio.org. From all of us here at Uptown Radio, thanks for listening.